All right, so principles of inheritance. All right, so as an introduction, we're saying here that human traits or human characteristics, such as eye color and hair color, these are passed down from one generation to the next, right? So I want us to establish two definitions, right? We use the term heredity and then we use the term genetics, and sometimes we use them interchangeably, and that's not correct to do, right? These are two different words with two very different meanings, right? Heredity, jot this down. Heredity refers to the transmission of genetic information from parent to offspring. That is heredity. All right. Heredity, as we know, typically follows a predictable pattern in organisms, right? So scientists, Gregor Mendel and so many others have contributed quite a bit of knowledge over the past, several decades, that we now know that there is this sort of predictable pattern of inheritance, right? Directly related to our genes, right? Our genetic makeup. So heredity is the transmission of genetic information from parent to offspring, while genetics, right? Genetics refers to a science, all right? Genetics is the science that studies heredity, right? So this is a branch of science. All right, so like we define biology as the study of life, that is a branch of science, right? Genetics is a branch of science that studies heredity, right? The transmission of genetic information from parent to offspring. So that distinction is very important. I want you to leave this class using these terms correctly. Okay, and so genetics studies both the genetic similarities and genetic variations within populations or organisms, right? So we're studying variations from mom to offspring, right? We're looking at these features and characteristics that are observable, right? The phenotype, right? We can study the genotype, phenotype. So we can study variations and similarities between, parents and offsprings, and then also amongst individuals in a population, right? We do study populations of individuals to learn and to gather information from a genetic standpoint. All right. So heredity, the transmission of information from parents to offspring, genetics as the study of heredity. All right. So the study of inheritance began many, many years ago, and the work of Gregor Mendel has tremendously enhanced what we know to be true about inheritance. All right, this transmission of genetic information from parent to offspring. So Gregor Mendel is often referred to as the father of genetics, right? So he was this monk that conducted a number of experiments where he was basically breeding plants, right? Plants are organisms, right? We've established that they are a type of living thing. So these organisms, these plants were bred over, long periods of time, and observation and data were collected, and we gathered these laws of inheritance that we now know to be true. Right. So he conducted a number of experiments, and all of the findings were now extended over time by other scientists who sort of kind of came and worked behind him. So his findings were extended, and now we have information that we hold to be true in terms of how this transmission of genetic information works. Okay. So Gregor Mendel, all right, he has contributed quite a lot. His work with breeding these pea plants has been the foundation of what we now refer to as Mendelian genetics. Okay, these patterns of inheritance that we now rely on for understanding heredity were due to the works of Gregor Mendel. All right, so let's start with some genetic terminology. Jot these terms down. Gene, right? So we've established what genes are in the context of our DNA and chromosomes. We know that genes code for traits, right? So we're going to define a gene now in this unit as an inherited factor, right? This is our DNA. This inherited factor determines a specific characteristic or trait about an individual, right? A characteristic or a trait. What is a trait? This is something that you guys, you've heard this term before. What is a trait? What is a trait? What are traits?
Freckles, a certain hair texture.
Right. So like it's a feature, right? It's a characteristic or a feature. An example of a trait, as you mentioned, is your hair color. Absolutely. Your eye color, right? That is a trait or a feature about you. All right. And so these genes determine traits, right? And because we know that there are many different possibilities of traits, genes come in different versions that we call alleles, right? So for example, we'll say eye color, because we all know that we can all have different eye colors, right? So the trait itself is eye color. Okay, that is the feature that we're that's in question, right? But the many different possibilities of eye colors are determined by the different version of the gene, and that's what we call an allele. So genes can come in different versions, right? It's still coding for the same trait, which in this example is eye color, but depending on the version of the gene, okay, it's going to determine if you have blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes or gray eyes. That's what an allele is. An allele is a gene. It's a different version of the gene. All right. So you should be able to distinguish between the definition of a gene and an allele. So genes are inherited factors that determine traits. These genes can come in different forms or versions, and we call those alleles. So we inherit 2 alleles for each gene in our bodies. All right. So in Gregor Mendel's experiments, he's doing all these different crosses and breedings in the pea plants. The shape of the seed is determined by a gene, right? These seeds are going to become plants, right? So one trait that is genetically controlled is the shape of the seed, right? Is the seed round or is it wrinkled? Okay. The shape of the seed is determined by a gene. Okay. This gene exists as to this, this trait, shape. Okay. In this example, shape. This trait exists as 2 different alleles, right? One allele is going to make a round seed, and the other allele would encode a wrinkled seed, right? So genes determine traits. Different forms of the gene can exist, and we call those alleles. And we typically inherit alleles in pairs. We get 2 sets of alleles, 2 alleles for each trait, right? And in this case, Gregor Mendel, in his experiments, seed shape was one thing that he examined. What questions do we have about this? What questions do we have? Okay, so that's one term. All right, we're still going through some terminology here. All alleles for a particular gene will be found at a specific place on the chromosome called a locus, right? Remember, we talked about the chromosomes. We looked at the human karyotype and we saw the layout for all of the 23 pairs of chromosomes in the human, right? And so I mentioned the Human Genome Project as an effort that has mapped the human genome. And so we know where each gene is located on which chromosome. And the particular place on said chromosome is referred to as the locus. The locus is the location of the specific place on the chromosome that we can find a particular gene. Okay, so there is a specific place that we call the locus on the chromosome in the pea plant that determines the shape of that seed. All right, we're still with our seeded example here from Gregor Mendel's pea plant experimentations, the breeding. Right, so there's a specific place on a specific chromosome that we can find the gene that determines the shape of that seed. Jot that down. Any questions about the locus? The locus refers to the specific place on the chromosome where we can find a gene. All right, some more terminology. The term genotype. You will hear this term a lot. The genotype refers to your entire set of genes that an organism has. All of the genes in your body is your genotype. The set of genes that makes up an individual is your genotype. Okay. So these alleles, as I mentioned, exist in pairs. These alleles, right? These different versions of genes, they're going to exist in pairs. An organism with two identical copies of an allele, that's said to be a homozygous pair. All right, so we're using the example of eye color, right? The gene that determines our eye color. Two alleles possible, right? If you have two identical copies of that allele that's determining your eye color, we're going to say that's a homozygous pair of alleles. If you have two different copies of that allele, we're going to say that's a heterozygous copy or pair. So again, remember, we are hybrid organisms. You've inherited genetic information from both mom and dad. So we can theoretically say that you're getting your one allele from mom and another allele from dad. These two alleles are going to still code for the same trait, which is eye color, but perhaps you're inheriting the allele for blue eyes from mom and the allele for brown eyes from dad. So you've got two copies of these alleles in your body. Now, do they exist as a homozygous pair of alleles where you have two identical copies of this allele, or do they exist as heterozygote pairs where you have two different copies of this allele? Okay. Your genotype is your entire set of alleles or genes that make up who you are. Each set of alleles can exist as either a homozygous pair or a heterozygous pair. What questions do we have about that information? Any questions? Sweet. So if we're looking at this schematic here, we have the example. I'm using eye color because we all can sort of identify with eye color very easily, right? So these two alleles right here, we have a this individual is a heterozygous individual, right? This person has an allele for brown eyes and an allele for blue eyes, right? Individual B is a homozygous, has a homozygous pair of alleles for eye color, right? So no matter if brown is dominant or recessive, this person is going to have brown eyes because there's only an allele for brown eyes, okay? However, in individual A, because they have a heterozygous pair of alleles, on surface, we don't know. Without more information, we don't know if this individual will be presenting with blue eyes or brown eyes, right? But looking at our legend here, this legend tells us that the blue allele is a recessive allele and that The brown allele is a dominant allele, right? So there's another concept of dominance and recessive that we have to understand if we were to interpret this allele assignment. Okay. Dominant alleles are those that we actually see physically in the individual, and recessive alleles would be hidden, right? So in this heterozygous pair of alleles for eye color, right, we have a dominant brown and a recessive blue. So this individual would physically present with brown eyes. All right. We'll come back to this concept of dominance and recessive. All right. So right now we established our genotype. What is a genotype? Defining the genotype would tell you that a genotype is the total set of genes or alleles that an individual has. That is your genotype. Okay. Your phenotype, though, on the other hand, is the outward appearance of characteristics. This is what you physically look like. Okay. Phenotype refers to physical, physiological, and behavioral manifestations of your genes, right? So these are all of the things apart from your DNA. So your genotype is your set of genes that you have in your body. Your genotype determines your phenotype. The phenotype is the outward appearance of characteristics or traits. Your phenotype is determined by your genotype. All right. So you think about your phenotype. I always remember them by P. Phenotype starts with P, and we're referring to our physical features, physiological features, as well as behavioral features. We know that these are all determined by our DNA, which is our genotype. These physical features, your eye color, hair color, skin color, how you behave. Physiological features refers to how you function. Okay, how your body functions. Behavioral features, we do know that our behavior, there are certain behavioral factors that are genetically based or determined by your set of genes. Okay, things like mental retardation, those are that's a behavioral feature that is determined by your genes. Okay, so for Mendel's experiment, we're always going to bounce back to Gregor Mendel's work because that laid the foundation for the things that we understand about heredity. So in his experiment where he was breeding those pea plants and looking at different features, the appearance of a round seed versus a wrinkled seed, that is a phenotype. That round seed is a physical feature. That is a phenotype of that plant. Okay. And so the point we're making here is that a phenotype is determined by the genotype. Make sure you write that down. A phenotype is determined from the genotype. So your physical features, your outward appearance is determined by your set of genes that you have, your DNA. What questions do we have about that? Is this all making sense?
Yes.
Perfect. So, one important concept, I know this is a lot of information. One important point as we're talking about inheritance, you need to understand that only alleles or genes, right? Versions of genes, only the allele of the genotype is inherited, right? Jot that down. Only the allele itself, the gene, is inherited. You don't inherit a phenotype. So organisms do not transmit their phenotype to the next generation. What you are transmitting to the next generation is your genotype. You must understand that concept. I will ask you a question about this on your exam. You do not transmit a phenotype. You cannot transmit a physical feature. What you transmit is the gene that determines that feature. So if someone says you and your dad has the same nose, well, he didn't transmit the shape and appearance of that nose to you. What he transmitted to you was the set of genes that determined what that nose was going to look like. Right? Does that make sense? So you cannot inherit a phenotype. If I asked you some type of a true or false question or something of that nature, you cannot inherit a phenotype. You do not inherit the shape of your lips. You inherit genes that determine the shape of your lips. Questions? Any questions? Sweet. Okay. Now, I mentioned the term dominant and recessive a few minutes ago. Okay. So we said that we have two sets of alleles for each trait. Okay. Those sets of alleles can either be a dominant or recessive allele. Okay. Jot this information down. If the allele is dominant, the dominant allele is going to be the form of the trait that is observed in the phenotype, right? So we had the example where we had a heterozygous pair of alleles for eye color, two alleles in a set, one for brown eyes and one for blue eyes. Okay. The dominant allele in this heterozygous pair is going to be the form that we see physically observed in the phenotype. When I'm looking at you, the dominant allele is going to be present. In that heterozygous example we used, the allele for brown eyes was dominant and the allele for blue eyes was recessive. So when I'm physically looking at that individual, that person would have brown eyes. So we're saying by definition, dominant forms of the allele are going to be observed and the recessive form of that allele will be what we call repressed or masked. It will not show up in the phenotype. So recessive alleles are masked or repressed in the presence of a dominant allele. This is a very important concept in heredity, in our principles of heredity. The only time the recessive form of an allele will show up is in the absence of that dominant allele. So what does that mean? It means then that you're going to have two copies of the recessive allele in order to see that trait. Work that out in your head. Make it make sense. We have a dominant and we have a recessive. Anytime the dominant allele is present in the pair, you're always going to see that dominant form present in the phenotype. The only time we see the manifestations of a recessive allele in the phenotype is in the absence of that dominant allele. So in other words, we've got to have two copies of a recessive trait in order for that trait to show up in the phenotype. That is what we refer to as our homozygous pair. Homo means same. That prefix homo means same. Hetero means different. Work that out in your head. Okay. Let's look at this example again. An important concept here is that when two alleles of a genotype are different, okay? When two alleles of a genotype are different, only the trait encoded by the dominant allele is observed. All right, let's look at these examples here. All right, we're still looking at the example of the trait eye color. We have two sets of alleles that determines a trait. Okay, this key is telling us that the blue allele, that the allele for blue eyes is recessive and the allele for brown eyes is dominant. So help me out here. Let's look at individual A. This is a heterozygous pair of alleles, okay? Because we have two different forms here. So this is a heterozygous pair. Individual A has a heterozygous pair of alleles. So help me out. With individual A, if you're looking at individual A, would this person have blue eyes or brown eyes? Help me out.
Brown.
Brown eyes. Why?
Because the brown allele is dominant and it's heterozygous, so only the brown one will show.
Absolutely. The answer is that because the brown allele is dominant. So no matter what arrangement we have here, a heterozygous, homozygous, the dominant form is present, and that's what's going to physically be seen. All right, thank you. Individual B, is this person going to have, what color eyes would individual B have? Somebody help me out.
Brown.
Brown eyes, right? Brown eyes for two reasons. A, because the dominant form of the allele is present, but B, because this is a homozygous pair of alleles and he doesn't have any other options for another color. Okay. So individual A has brown eyes, individual B has brown eyes. Let's look at individual C. What color eyes are individual C going to have?
Baby blue.
This person is going to have blue eyes, right? Blue is a recessive trait, right? This blue allele is recessive. And so the only time we see in the phenotype the recessive allele, the recessive form of the trait, is in the absence of the dominant form, right? So that basically means is that you've got to have two copies of a recessive allele in order to manifest that recessive trait. So individual C here has a homozygous pair of recessive alleles. This person would have blue eyes, no matter what. Okay. So do we understand the concept of dominance and recessive? Yes?
No, ma'am.
No? Did I get a no?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So think about it like this, right? So, we talked about meiosis. We talked about, that process of crossing over and sort of the random distributions of chromosomes and so forth. So as an individual, you're born with these genes, and genes determine traits. Each gene that we inherit, right, that's going to determine a different trait, like your skin color, your hair color, eye color in this case. Each gene is going to have two versions. Those different versions of the genes are called alleles. Right? And we're just kind of, I'm trying to theorize it so you can see it from the perspective of what's happening here with dominance and recessive. So we'll just say that you get two copies of each allele for each trait, right? We're sticking with eye color here. So your eye color is determined by what alleles you inherit. So these alleles that you inherit can either be dominant or recessive. Okay, two forms of this gene, right? You inherit a gene that's going to determine your eye color. In this example here, this person inherited an allele that would say that they're going to have blue eyes, and they inherited an allele that says that they're going to have brown eyes, right? Just think you inherited one from mom, one from dad. This is your genotype. This is what your genetics look like as we're doing genetic analysis. We're looking at your genes. We see that you have an allele that can either mean that your eyes are going to be blue or they're going to be brown. Looking at your genotype. And because we know that the allele for blue eyes is what we call recessive, and the allele for brown eyes is what we call dominant, we know that the dominant form of the gene is what we would physically see in a person. So the concept of dominance and recessive tells us that anytime one of our pairs of alleles is dominant, that's the eye color we can expect to see when that individual is born. Dominant. The recessive form is going to be masked or overshadowed, if you will. Okay. It will not be present in the offspring from a physical standpoint. Okay. It's there in the background, but because the dominant form is present, that's what's going to manifest if you physically look at this individual. Right? So the concept of dominant and recessive says that the dominant form is going to be observed while the recessive form is repressed. All right? So you're inheriting two copies of the allele for this trait. For any given trait, you're inheriting two copies of the gene, right? The allele is a version of the gene. You're inheriting two versions of this gene that's going to dictate your eye color. And one of them may be dominant, one of them may be recessive. The dominant form is the form that you will physically see in the offspring. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay. Somebody else, the person that I was trying to clear it up for. Did I clear it up a little bit?
Yes, ma'am. It makes sense.
Makes sense. Okay. Are you sure?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right. All right. Let's stop here today. I know this is a lot of information. We'll stop here with dominant and recessive.